As we all take our seats, I'm just going to preview that at 3 o'clock we have the career fair, and it's going to be at the Healy Family Center. I think most of you know where that is, but it's back that way. But to get there, you would go out the main doors and turn right and right and right. Most of you know that much better than I, but I'll just say that in advance. Really appreciate everybody being here today. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn over the final panel to Dina Temple-Raston of NPR, who has been their counterterrorism correspondent for a decade. She's currently on leave writing a book or doing a podcast on decision-making in the adolescent brain. These may actually be slightly similar topics, counterterrorism in the adolescent brain, at least with 2 teenagers in the house. I sometimes think they are. So I need that podcast as soon as possible, Dina. So thank you for doing it. And thank you, everybody, for reconvening. Over to you for the final panel.
Hi there. Is the microphone on? OK, great. So I guess I would say to Michael, the bio is a little out of date. And the podcast is out. It's called What Were You Thinking? And it does have a terrorism bent to it. The first episode, we interview Abdullahi Yusuf, who's the only kid in America who went through jihadi rehab and came out on the other side. So we have that for you, Michael. And I'm at NPR now doing a technology project for them that's going to look at cyber and some other things that stay tuned. But I'm here today in my capacity as a moderator of all things national security. And the panel is amazing. To my right is Rich Girven. He is a senior defense research analyst and associate director of the Intelligence Policy Center and international market manager. Wow, there's a lot here for the National Security Research Division. And he's at RAND now, and he comes from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, where he served as the director of analysis. And we're going to be talking to him about how analysis works and the building blocks of that. Susan Kalweit, is the director of the Analysis Directorate at the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. And she's responsible for leading the NGA's geospatial intelligence and modernizing its analytical efforts. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Anne Neuberger is the director of the NSA's Central Security Service, and she does a lot with the commercial industry. And the center was created in 2005 to leverage commercial relationships. I've seen her at numerous occasions at different panels that I've been going to, and I'm super excited that she's here. And last but definitely not least is Ned Price, who was the special assistant to President Barack Obama on the National Security Council. He was the spokesperson and senior director for strategic communications. He was also a senior analyst at the CIA, and he was a PDB briefer. And in most audiences, I have to explain what a PDB is, but I know I don't have to for this audience, so that's terrific. So thank you all for being here. I wanted to start with you, Rich, and wanted to sort of build on how intelligence analysis is done, just to go with the building blocks. And how do you traditionally, when you have a piece of intelligence, how do you integrate that into the broader picture?
So that's a really good question. And it's one I've had to answer several times throughout my career, but I go back and I apologize if it's too simple, but I'll tell you what I told my grandmother when she asked me. I was an Army major. I was on my first tour as an analyst at DIA. And she said, "What do you do?" And I said, I'm an Indian military political analyst. And she said, "Yeah, but what do you do?" I said, "I'm an intelligence analyst, Grandma." And she said, yeah, but what is that? What do you do? How do you break it down for your grandmother, right? And so the issue is, I said, look, I sit in a big building, and people bring me pieces of a puzzle all day long. Only I don't have a picture of the puzzle, the box to look at, and I don't know what puzzle it goes to. There are hundreds of puzzle pieces coming to my desk every day, and I sort them. Some are blue, some are green, some are red, and I try and figure out. Every once in a while, I get a couple to come together, or I walk down the hall and I talk to somebody else, and I say, now some of those puzzle pieces are pictures, and some are signals intelligence. It's things that we intercept. Some of it is notes that come from humans that are somewhere in the world that tell me what's going on. And there are billions of puzzles out there, and I don't always know what they are. That's what I do. And then my grandmother said thanks and walked away. I don't think she understood, but it's sort of what we do. So your question about how do you integrate a new piece of intelligence, there's a lot wrapped up in that. Is it an image? Do I know what country it came from? Do I know the provenance? Do I know the credibility of the source for the information that was provided? Will I accept that into the analytic line that I already have in place? So for any question you could ask, there are requirements that say, what is the color of the sky? How deep is the ocean? Or something much more nefarious. And we have a position at an agency that says this is how deep the ocean is according to our analysis. Then some new piece of information comes in. I determine it's credible. I talk to others. I talk to other agencies. And then we integrate that in. It turns out that the ocean's a lot deeper than we thought it was, or the sky is a lot bluer than we thought it was, or the missiles are a lot closer to being launched than we thought they were.
It's not unlike what journalists do.
I think that's true.
Credible sources, putting things together. Sometimes the puzzle piece is about something else than you think it is. And Anne, how do you avoid not getting into groupthink or assuming that the puzzle piece goes to puzzle A, B, or C as opposed to something completely different?
So interesting question. I often think of two particular items when we think of those kinds of questions. The first was, so my parents were on a plane that was hijacked back in 1976. And after September 11th, and they were held hostage for a week and ultimately saved in a military operation. And after September 11th, my dad commented to me, he said, back when there was a rage of hijackings in the 70s and 80s, we as hostages understood our role was to keep quiet. Our role was not to antagonize any individual hijacker because we were tools to an end. We were tools to whatever end there was, whether it was freeing others they wanted to free in prison, achieving some political goal. After September 11th, we saw hijackings where hijacking was the end in and of itself, right? Where the plane itself became a weapon. Something changed in the mental framework by which hijacking as a tool of terror was used, and the intel analytic community hadn't necessarily changed in line with that. Robert Jervis wrote a really interesting study on intelligence failure. That's the second pole we often think of. And he talked about what led to some items where, intelligence is not looking into a crystal ball. The question always we ask ourselves is, did the analysts come to the right set of conclusions given the information that was available at that time? And he points to humans having sometimes contextual frameworks by which we look at information and not necessarily writing down what the sources of that contextual framework is and what would cause that framework to change. And in fact, when we look at the topic of this conference, artificial intelligence, that's a really interesting contribution artificial intelligence can make to the intelligence field by looking at a set of information, and there's some challenges if the set of information comes from a narrow space, it'll have the same limits, but gathering and augmenting all the knowledge in that set of information and offering alternative frameworks to just challenge what could potentially be unintentional groupthink just because folks have approached something, whether it's an understanding of cultural, regional, religious factors that may have changed, and we don't even understand that we're making decisions or we're doing analysis based on those factors, and as a result, we may not change our conclusion even though one of those factors have changed.
So is what you're saying is artificial intelligence will actually make you think about something in a different way than you might have otherwise?
I'm saying it has but it's never a silver bullet. But because it represents the aggregate of so much thinking, and because it may not have the same limits as, we're not intentionally looking at things through the same framework. We don't realize it. It can so I'll give a terrorism example in your case, right? One of the ways that we start, the hardest challenge in the counterterrorism field is understanding either the lone wolf, of course, but also how do you identify individuals who are not yet known, who may be part of a terror activity. And one of the ways we do that is by identifying a set of behaviors, folks who are in a region, folks who talk to individual people, folks who behave in certain ways, a language spoken in a region where it's not native to that language and where we know individuals are aggregating. And that helps us identify individuals who may well be, kind of give us indications and warning to say, put a human analyst on that. So artificial intelligence offers up the opportunity to take that kind of analysis to say, what are the attributes of a given set of activities and apply it against a broad set of knowledge, e.g. a different region, where we may be able to say, that same set of behaviors are in that region. That's something for us to look at.
And are you not worried that artificial intelligence will act, because of the way the algorithm is written, that it might introduce bias? For example, let's just use a super easy example. You have an algorithm to take a second look at people who have spent 6 weeks in Pakistan. Because as a general matter, at least in the old days, it took about 6 weeks to get to the training camp, get your training, and get out again. So you would naturally then have a bias towards people who might be brown, might be Pakistani, and might have family in Pakistan. How do you avoid something like that with artificial intelligence?
So like we said, first, it's not a silver bullet. I think where it's most useful is the intelligence community today, at least in my field, in signals intelligence, struggles with the huge explosion of data that's occurred in the last decade and a half. So the most significant thing we need to do is triage. Look at that huge set of information and say, what is important enough for us to look at and study? And that's where artificial intelligence is particularly helpful from a triage perspective. At this point, are we using it for completed intelligence? No. We're using it for more rapid machine translation of languages where we don't have enough analysts, to say, here's of this broad swath of information, what's important enough that it crosses some threshold to be looked at. And yes, given it is, at least for supervised learning, the aggregation of a lot of human knowledge, as we've seen in various commercial examples, right? It will reflect the inherent biases there. So when we get to more learning from the data itself and combining that with what the human knowledge is, more the machine learning aspect, it offers the ability, it'll help get by and correct or work around that bias. But more importantly, we use it mostly as I said, as indications and warning, as a triage function.
Susan, let me have you jump in here since you're doing a lot of the modernization efforts. How does AI and machine learning, how is that changing the dynamic in intelligence? 5 years ago, I remember talking to a lot of intelligence analysts who used to say to me, they're going to try and replace me with a machine. What's really important is human creativity and ability to see two things put together. And now it just seems like people are talking about AI and machine learning in a totally different way. Can you walk us through that change?
Yeah, thanks for asking the question, Dina. And I'd like to respond to it in a breadth of ways that AI, machine learning, augmentation are being used. And so very narrow AI, we see a lot in NGA in the form of computer vision, which has really become well accepted by analysts and actually very desirable by analysts, where it helps them sort through their day. What image do I need to look at first?
Sorry, what did you call it? Computer vision?
Computer vision. So computer vision is the technology that that's used, for instance, facial recognition, or in Facebook can say that's a cat, not a dog, et cetera. So we're using it to determine that there's activity or no activity. And where there's activity that hadn't been there before, cueing the analysts that of your 100 images, look at these 10. Previously, they felt compelled to look at all 100. And I've got examples, for instance, of specific issues where it took me 4 analysts just to work through the daily take because they felt compelled to have to look at every single time a certain piece of geography, a picture was taken of it. Yet rarely or infrequently was there activity to report on. Now, with the use of computer vision, they're directed to look at these 10. And so instead of 4 people, I now have 1 person who is focused on looking at where there's the most likely, highest likelihood of activity to report on, which is important. And they're enjoying their work more because it's now more interesting. And the other 3 are able to go off and delve into other problems and other issues that are either hadn't been done before or require more time and attention to work. So that's in the narrow use of it. On the more cognitive end of it, I thought I would address it in the form of tradecraft, because some of what Anne was addressing too really gets to the heart of tradecraft. And going back to 9/11, So the 9/11 Commission report pointed to 2 failures in the intelligence community. One of those failures was a failure to have and enforce standards. And a second was a failure of imagination. And in some respects, those 2 failures actually compete with each other. And we see that in the analytic tradecraft standards that exist right now. There's 9 analytic tradecraft standards. For those of you who are learning about structured analytic techniques and critical thinking, those are all skill sets that apply to developing your tradecraft, developing your standards. But number 4 of the 9 standards is around analysis of alternatives, which basically directs us to use our imagination, to think outside the box. What else, besides the obvious of what your initial bias says it is, what else could it be? Tradecraft standard number 8, though, assesses you on making accurate judgments and assessments. So if you're being driven on the one hand to make accurate judgments and assessments, and on the other hand to think of analysis of alternatives, they conflict. And it's a human tendency to want to be right, to not throw something out there that is kind of way out, in the middle of who would ever think that we would use an airplane as a guided missile, right, as the example in 9/11. Yet the importance of using imagination, of that creative out-of-the-box, can't be overstated in intelligence analysis. So in the course of modernizing our analysis, I would say there's sort of 3 things that we need to do centered around creating a culture of imagination. And that becomes really important. And the first of those in creating a culture of imagination is really creating safe environments where analysts can get together and feel that they can have these out-of-the-box, crazy ideas of what all the data could possibly mean. And creating those safe environments is a cultural shift.
So it's an intelligence kegger.
Yes, yes. And supporting that kegger is your machines, right? Because your machines can assist you in positing a multitude of alternatives, right? Using Monte Carlo simulation and other kinds of ways to think about what all the possibilities are. The machines aren't looking to give the right answer. They're looking to give you a series of plausible possibilities.
So you put it through some program and then it pops up and asks you questions?
There are technologies that do exactly that. You ask it a question and then it will look at the wealth of information that it has access to, for instance, which is why big data in the intelligence business is so critically important. Because the more data that the machine has to test its hypothesis, its simulations, its possibilities, then the more it can come back and ask you a question, or it will, and through any multiple types of visual means, large bubbles, or putting it in a 4x4 grid or 2x2 grid, just offer, here are some areas of possibility. The third part, after you create a culture or you create an environment where it's safe to have these discussions and you create the machines and you have the machines that allow you to posit these, the third part is having multidisciplinary and multi-experienced teams working these problems together. Because then those alternatives that the machines are offering, one person with one background and experience will say, I get it. I understand why that's possible because in my experience or the way I look at this information, that makes sense. And somebody else may say, I've never heard of that before. I'm more attuned to this particular answer. And it allows the debate and discussion in the safe environment and to go back to the machine and ask another question of the data. So those multidisciplinary teams working with the machines then create that opportunity to have the analysis of alternatives in the course of conducting your analysis using all the data that's available. So I think that's a real shift in terms of modernizing the way we do intelligence analysis.
Ned, we talk about failure of imagination all the time. And not just when it comes to 9/11, but some people would say maybe the election hacking was a failure of imagination. Maybe the North Korean nuclear program and the way it's developed was a failure of imagination. Being on the policy side, what policy suggestions would you make to stop the so-called failure of imagination?
So I think you're exactly right, Dina. The 9/11 Commission report obviously listed a failure of imagination, as Susan said, as one of the key flaws that preceded those devastating attacks. But I think if you look at subsequent intelligence failures, you see shadows of the same thing. The war in Iraq, the assessment in 2002 and 2003 before the invasion, of course, there were technical elements of it. Most of the intelligence community misperceived the use of aluminum tubes, but there was also a failure to grasp that, you know what, maybe Saddam had given up his weapons, but he led his lieutenants to believe otherwise. And that's why we were picking up indications from his underlings that there actually was an extant WMD program. If you look at the rise of ISIL, I think it was hard for much of the US government, especially after spending billions upon billions of dollars getting the Iraqi security forces up to speed, to imagine that they could have just melted away and allowed ISIL to continue their march from Mosul into Syria. And I think in the case of Russia, the election hack that you referenced, this is another case where we had data points. We knew, the FBI knew, the intelligence community knew that the DNC had been hacked. We knew that our strategic near-peer adversaries would be going after political institutions and organizations. We famously saw the Chinese do it against the McCain and Obama campaigns in 2008. We saw some of the bots and online activity. We saw Guccifer 2.0 and WikiLeaks and DC Leaks all come to life. But it wasn't until those entities came to life that I think there was a realization, both in the intelligence community and in the policy community, one informed by the other, of course, that what the Russians were doing was different from intelligence collection. It was different from traditional espionage. They were actually weaponizing this information, and they were using this information to undertake a covert action. That's something we failed to imagine, and I think it's something we probably should have imagined given the Russian tradecraft. In 2014, there was a really famous, notorious incident of the Russians collecting the phone call of Victoria Nuland, who at the time was Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, talking to our ambassador in Ukraine. And lo and behold, the recording ends up on YouTube. And so,
what's in the recording?
And in the recording, she is saying she has some candid, shall we say, words, including about our European partners. She at one time says, "F the EU," and it's perceived that she and our ambassador are sort of picking who's going to be in the next Ukrainian government. So you can see why the Russians would have an incentive to leak something like that. So we had previously seen the Russians collect and then weaponize. But in the case of the 2016 collection and covert action, I think we failed to imagine that they were doing this in that instance until it was too late.
May I just jump in here and say that maybe also part of the failure of imagination was there was this feeling among everyone that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and as a result, they were sort of leaning over backwards on their heels to not look like they were putting their thumbs on the scale.
So I think you have to differentiate between what the intelligence community was doing and the policy community was doing. I think certainly on the policy side of things, there was an effort with the election going the way everyone thought it would go, with the Republican nominee sort of prone to say the system is rigged. I think that those two things sort of collided, and it made the policy community, especially the Obama administration, take a very hands-off approach to this thing, perhaps more so than otherwise would have been the case.
But in the end, they have to make the decisions, right? Which is something that we'll get to in a second here, is that you can have all the analysis in the world, but if the decision makers are not accepting that analysis and acting on it, then it doesn't matter how much analysis you have.
I think that's true. I think in this case, those dots, the intelligence collection effort and the potential for weaponization weren't put together in a way that was as forceful enough early enough. And so I think something that we saw, and I saw this both at the CIA and then at the NSC, is the need for alternative analysis to become analysis. The alternative needs to be folded into analytic products and to be presented to to policymakers so that they don't have to go read a red cell assessment. They don't have to take they don't have to review a look at an issue that, by its very definition, is outside the box and structured in such a way to arrive at an alternative conclusion. I think too often those two things are separated. You have analysis, and then you have the low probability but high impact possibility that's presented separately, and especially for policymakers who are busy enough just reading what they have to read about the challenge of the day, it's sometimes a stretch to ask them to go and read what could be a plausible alternative.
So are you saying the plausible alternative is in a paragraph at the end?
I think that's one way to do it, and it's something that I think increasingly, at least I saw on the policy side of things, and it seems to be a more effective way to handle it.
Did you want to say something, Anne? Or?
Just bringing the points together, I really enjoyed listening to Nate's comments. One of the other items cited as one of the reasons for the intelligence challenges around 9/11 was technology had changed, and policy and the intelligence community's processes and the policies that go around that had not changed. So specifically, communications had changed, whereas in the past communications were very geographically in a given region, and agency responsibilities aligned with that. In our case, FBI, very much a domestic intelligence agency, managing responsible for domestic communications, NSA, a foreign intelligence agency focused outside the US and outside communications. And indeed, prior to 9/11, one of the causes noted in the commission report was there was a terrorist who was already in the United States talking with a planner overseas. NSA, we had the communications, we looked at it and said, oh, one side US, that's not ours, step back. FBI looked at it and said, oh, one side foreign, that's not ours. Policy and law had not adapted to where recognizing that communications were now global, recognizing that an individual's communications, even between two individuals in Afghanistan, could well cross the world and come back, or that individuals would be communicating across borders, that needed to change. And the reason I note that today is, from my perspective, looking at areas where, so as we noted earlier, machine learning, artificial intelligence offers tremendous promise to offer alternate frameworks for human analysts to look at and to challenge conclusions that we made, to your point, that may be a failure of imagination. However, in order for it to be useful as part of decisions, one of the foundational items Sue just talked about with regard to analytic integrity is showing what elements cause an analyst to come up to a conclusion, right? To come to a conclusion.
So show your work.
Show your work. The power of AI in some cases is bringing together alternate data or bringing together patterns of analysis that a human may not necessarily understand are related, or may not necessarily, but may be part of an alternate conclusion. But if we say show your work, we can't always understand the algorithm in that black box. And currently, that usability is a key policy question for us. So we're not saying necessarily use it to write your ultimate conclusion, but can it be used to generate some alternate framework ideas for human analysts to consider? And I cite that because, looking back to your question about a failure of imagination, 9/11, I also look at it as a failure of policy and law to keep up with where technology had advanced to enable intelligence to be as creative as possible. And I think we're in a very similar space in that big data machine learning area right now.
Okay, I'd like to have a lightning round before we go to questions. And the lightning round is this. What was the last big thing that we missed?
Yeah, I'll start. I would say I actually pulsed my senior GON officer corps for this to check it, and the answer was, we don't know.
That's encouraging. What's your second answer?
In that it's been missed and we don't know it yet.
Okay. How about
so that's the issue with black swans. We don't know at this point. We don't know what we've already missed. There's so many things we can imagine unless we have that failure of imagination. And I'd like to circle back at some point to failure of imagination, because it doesn't just occur on the intel side, it occurs on the policy side. I think perhaps We might talk about North Korean nuclear program writ large as something that the intelligence community got mostly right, but in certain ways they got wrong, right? We've been long talking about the long arc of North Korea's ability to develop a nuclear capability, but we saw recently that it happened a whole lot faster at the end than the IC probably predicted it would. And surely the predictions changed over time and those numbers got shorter. So it really is based on when did you make the prediction and when did you think it would happen. But one of the things that we don't do well in the intelligence community often is to go back and check our work. We're so busy going forward to see what the next predictions are that we don't look back a year or 2 years or 5 years to say, hey, we made 1,600 predictions in this part of this agency 5 years ago. How many of them did we get right? And that's important because what we ought to do is go back and figure out, hey, maybe this branch or maybe this analyst got it right more often than others, and then find out why. What is it that you do different from everybody else? So we can get back to the tradecraft that Sue was talking about and figure out that those 13 analytic tradecraft standards that are in the March 2009 community tradecraft book that everybody uses, although different agencies use different ones of those, where did those come from? Well, they were written down. And why are they valid? Well, because they're in that book. But have we tested them? Well, they're in the book. We use those. When do you use them? Well, will you use the ones you want to use? Is there a standard? And we actually did a study on this just a couple of years ago to try and figure out, is there one? Rand, yeah, did a study. Did a study just a couple of years ago looking at structured analytic techniques usage in the intelligence community to figure out, is there a standard? When do you use competing alternative hypotheses? When do you use signposting? We don't have those standards. We don't know. So,
what was the name of that report?
It was an assessment of the use of structured analytic techniques in intelligence community products, or something very exciting like that.
Okay.
That's the Rand.
Excellent. You can rewind and write that down. Ned.
I think you can take this question both in the strategic and in the tactical. I think what you said about the North Korean nuclear program, there's some truth that I would say. The election interference we've talked about. I think what's just as interesting is to talk about it in the tactical sense. And you look at a couple smaller scale developments that I think have really had profound implications for not only bilateral relationships, but have had global implications. You look at what appears to be the Russian use of a chemical nerve agent on British soil. You look at what appears to be an ongoing attack against U.S. officials so far in Cuba and China that we still, if you read the latest accounts, haven't seemed to piece together fully. And so, to my mind, these big strategic failures of imaginations or intelligence failures only come around so often, but sadly, I think we often see tactical missed opportunities that can have outsized implications as well.
What do you think?
I think fully understanding cyberspace as an arena of great power competition. So we could look at one-off hacks into an individual company, not necessarily understand that what that really represented was, the driving power of a country is its economy and is its R&D investment. And Chinese one-off hacks into various creative US companies stealing of IP really represented a larger strategic goal in terms of growing an economy. Similarly, whether we talk about election interference, seeing cyberspace as that arena of great power competition and being prepared with the technology and policy issues that come with that to actually work that as an intelligence area and fully understand the implications.
Right, and from a cyber perspective, I think one of the things that is under discussion now has to do with how much of our foreign adversaries are actually inside our cyber. Supply chain, maybe a chip in an F-16 is a Chinese chip. Do we know that? And we haven't till now. So what I wanted to do is I have questions here. So people with the best handwriting get put to the top. So this is actually so you'll know it's your question, and I liked your handwriting. So I'm going to put two of them together. And this is for some of the students in the audience. And I'm going to just put these two together. What makes a good analyst today? And how is that different from 5 years ago? And then coming from the journalist, how important are strong writing skills to an analyst? I'm going to answer that one. Very important. Okay, what would you like? Somebody want to answer that? What makes a good analyst today, and how is it different from 5 years ago?
Yeah, I'll say number one, curiosity. Number two, the desire never to give up. If you think you've gotten to the end or to a dead end, keep going, because there's more information to discover, more knowledge to gain about a topic. As far as the writing skills, it's conveyance. Writing, verbal, so written, verbal, and visual. All three of those need to be spot on because you could be the best analyst, but if you can't convey the importance of what you've discovered to those who need to know it, all your great analytic skills are for naught.
At the risk of sounding like I'm an evangelist for journalism, these are the very same skills you need to be a journalist as well. Okay, next question. Oh, do you want to jump in?
So can I jump in on this? Because
Please
this
do.
is something, so I've been asked lots of times about what makes a good analyst. And there are hundreds of different analytic jobs in the community, so the answer is different for everyone. But the analyst that says, but wait, as a natural response to any new piece of information is a really good analyst. The analyst that jumps to a conclusion the minute they see something, oh, I know where that puzzle piece goes, that's a problem. I want somebody who thinks outside the box. I want the analyst that says, who said it's a box? When did it become a box? I want the analyst who can write well, who can brief well, who can speak well, who can persuade a policymaker to their point of view so that they understand what it is, but that doesn't have to use every single piece of knowledge that they have about the subject ad nauseum. You need to be able to speak at an 8th grade level or maybe even lower, depending on who you're talking to, when you're describing something. And I don't mean that as an insult, but as analysts, those of us who have been analysts, we know our subject matter forward and backwards. So if we start talking about missile technology and the blue wire and the red wire and how it connects to the warhead, and you're going to lose the policymaker. They want to know when's it going to launch and where is it, right? And what should I do about it?
I'm now asking the question. I think some of these students are asking themselves hearing your answer, and that is, okay, so how do you convey that in an interview, that you can think outside the box? How do you find that in a candidate for a job?
Well, so if the questions are right, you can always twist the answer to show how analytic you are. You want to be able to not just answer the question that's asked in an interview, but answer the underlying question that exists, right? So when somebody says, tell me something interesting about your background, if you're an equestrian and you want to talk about horse riding, that's okay, but that's not what they're getting to. They want to hear you say, I'm the kind of person that always understands the second meaning behind what it, so you want to answer questions that aren't asked. You want to twist those questions into a way that you can make it clear that you're an alternative thinker, that you look at things in a different way, that you're able to put 2 and 2 together and come up with 7 if 7 is the right answer, which it sometimes is.
What was your line again? Because I think they would like to write that down. I'm the kind of person who...
I don't know what I said.
Oh, okay.
It just comes out.
Dean, if I could just... so at NGA, we've added to our interview process a hands-on portion, and it's to get to understanding your creative thinking and analytic thinking process, which is we give you a problem, and we ask you to go take some time and go solve it, and then come back and describe for us how did you solve this problem, as well as what did you discern in doing your analysis. So
it's like a word problem?
No, it's like an intel type of problem, right? We pose an intelligence type of problem, offer some information related to that, and then ask the candidates to go figure it out.
Is there a right
what's
answer?
going on? Not necessarily. The important part is, how did you come to your conclusion? How did you use information? How did you think about the problem? What other questions did you ask that you felt you had to answer in order to address the issue?
How about you, Ann? Yeah.
Just one skill to add is somebody who's a good team player and a collaborator, because many of the toughest analytic problems we have cross disciplines. So you'll need people who can bring a particular very strong technical skill, e.g. a missile technology, understanding a given regional target, who are the key players, oh, that individual got it, he's not acting consistent with his usual pattern. That may be a highlight of a trigger of a transfer of missile technology, right? It takes, with language skills, with cultural skills. So many of our most successful teams are teams that cross disciplines, particularly technical, regional, cultural, and language. So an analyst who knows how to work well on a team, takes credit as a team for things, is a really effective analyst.
And how can you tell someone's like that when you're interviewing them? Do you have a question you ask or an answer you're looking for?
We sometimes see how often the person says I versus we. Talk about a success you've had. Does the individual talk about I repeatedly? I mean, there's always, we want somebody who takes pride in their work, somebody who feels proud of what they brought to a team and has drive and has ambition. But how often do they talk about, and it was particularly wonderful being a part of X, or I particularly enjoyed working with Y. When they talk about what they're looking to accomplish in a given role, do they talk about only what they seek to gain, but also what they seek to contribute? So those kinds of questions.
Is that why there's so many women analysts?
Some have made that point. But I don't think
they tend to say we more than men do.
As a mom of both a teen guy and a teen gal, I can say everybody can learn those skills.
Okay, excellent answer. How about you, Ned?
In addition to everything that's been said here, I would also make the point that experience is not always a proxy for effectiveness. And I think that in some teams, you will find that the analyst who has been on the account the longest tends to be more jaded, tends to sort of be more dismissive of new information. Oh, that can't be right because we know this group is not interested in attacking X country or Y country, or that they don't get their money from this source, they get it from that source. And so I think that coming at a problem, whether the ability to come at a problem, whether you've worked it for a week or 10 years, with a set of eyes that are effectively fresh, even if you've been on the same challenge for that whole time, I think that's something that also goes a long way in the analytic community.
So we've been talking about alternative thinking. How do you actually institutionalize that, given that we're in a political, bureaucratic environment? Anybody?
I think the intent of including analysis of alternatives as one of the tradecraft standards is an attempt really to institutionalize it, right? Because every intel agency, their analysis organization gets graded each year on each one of those standards. It is the standard that is least successful across the intelligence community. So I think, I'd go back and say instituting it is one about creating a culture whereby analysts feel that they can throw out wild and crazy ideas and that they will be accepted for those wild and crazy ideas and can come together on assessing at what confidence level or what probability those ideas really are relevant to answering the question.
Which is much easier said than done. What were you going to say?
I think one of the ways that you cultivate alternative thinking is to hire through diversity. And 10 years ago, by that, we would mean gender diversity, or we might mean racial diversity. But today, and more so going forward into the future, we're talking about diversity of philosophy, diversity of economic and social background, diversity of sexuality, diversity of the way you approach problems mentally, your cognitive processes. You want people in your organization who think about things differently so that you don't come to the same conclusion and get to groupthink that you were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm. What do you say?
I agree with both the ideas that were just said, and I think also as leaders in the organization, if you challenge folks, right? We all as humans, it's really easy to take the analytic conclusion that, we have very high confidence in this conclusion, et cetera, and there's this tendency sometimes to say, okay, let's move on. But saying, okay, what leads us to that conclusion? Have we reconsidered that? Are the sources of intelligence different? Is one this kind? Is one that kind? Have we consulted with another, who might be the group who might feel differently? Have we talked with them yet? So those kinds of questions show that it's okay to question, and that speaks to the point I think we have observed. I thought that was very well made. And sometimes the most experienced analyst is the one for whom the contextual framework is most firmly in place. So by the managers and leaders of that organization continuously not deferring to it, yes, showing respect for that level of background on a topic, but also saying, okay, explicitly, I had a boss a number of roles ago who did this really well. I was the new person on the team and came with a very different background. And he would explicitly say, Anne, what are your thoughts? And it invited my diversity of background into the conversation in a way that beyond having the personal confidence, it made clear that he valued that difference of perspective. And then once people have heard that difference a few times, folks will often say, oh, okay, what does X think? Or have we consulted with Y?
But that takes a certain amount of confidence as a manager, doesn't it?
It does, and a certain amount of appreciation for that diverse perspective. And I think that's one of the reasons across entities in the intelligence community, there's so much encouraging of people working in different agencies. I know, a shout out to NGA. When we have NGA analysts working closely with SIGINT analysts, the ability to see a picture and the ability to hear the story is just a much richer insight into what's going on.
Last word, Ned.
So I would say that part of the onus is also on the intelligence community to prove to the policy community the value of alternative thinking and alternative analysis. Throwing thousands of red cell analyses or low probability, high impact assessments across the transom and having it land on a policymaker's desk only to have that person sift through possibilities that never come to fruition, I think doesn't really add value. I think where it does add value and where policymakers really grasp that value is when they too are wrestling with questions that are fundamentally intelligence questions. There's a famous, of course, in the lead up to the mission that ultimately killed bin Laden, NCTC analysts were brought in to supplement the CIA intelligence, and they came in with a much lower confidence level that bin Laden actually was at this compound in Abbottabad. And ultimately, bin Laden was there, but talking to people who lived through that experience, you hear them say, well, look, they ultimately, some of what they were saying ultimately wasn't right, but they at least helped us think through the questions and helped us think through what we weren't thinking of, what we needed to be cognizant of as we were getting ready for this program and for this operation. And so I think finding ways to show policymakers the value, the hands-on value of that alternative analysis is something that the intelligence community could afford to do more of, I think.
Excellent. I wish we had about a half hour longer because I have 5 more questions for each of you. But please join me in thanking them very much for coming in this discussion.
And thank you all for staying with us through the day. We're wrapping up now. I have no closing remarks except to, again, extend my appreciation, my admiration for all the Georgetown Security Studies Program and School of Foreign Service do in this domain. I want to thank all the panelists and everyone else and remind you that the career fair will be around the way in the Healy Family Center. So 3 right turns once you go out the front door. Best wishes to everybody.
Last word, I get to thank our host and moderator here today. Michael, you were wonderful, and from NGA and from Georgetown, from Kalaris, my great appreciation. We too have a very old map of renewed Washington.
Fantastic. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.